In the fall of 2003, a county extension agent named Dale Presser drove his white pickup down a gravel road in Cass County, Nebraska, and stopped in front of a 200-acre farm that looked, by every measure he had been trained to apply, like a farm in the process of giving up. No combine in the machine shed, no center pivot irrigation rig on the south quarter, no anhydrous tanks, no herbicide wagon, no GPS guidance antenna bolted to the cab of anything. What he saw instead, spread across a lower pasture behind a post and wire fence, were 25 oxen, not beef cattle, not a feeder operation. Oxen, big, deliberate animals with wide horns and thick necks, standing in the autumn mud and regarding Dale Presser's pickup with the mild indifference of creatures that have been waiting out confident visitors for 400 years, and standing at the gate, with his hands in the pockets, the canvas coat, was a 63-year-old man named Virgil Haas, who had farmed that ground his entire adult life and had never once taken out a crop loan he could not pay back before Christmas. Dale Presser told Virgil Haas that October morning that he was going to lose the farm, not cruelly, not with any pleasure. He said it the way a doctor says a difficult thing, with charts and projections and the quiet authority of a man who has seen this situation before and knows how it ends. Commodity prices were low. Input costs for anybody still farming small acreage with labor-intensive methods were eating operators alive across the county. Without a combine to harvest at scale, without chemical weed control, without the efficiency ratios, the new equipment made possible, a 200-acre operation in Cass County had a life expectancy of about 4 years before the bank moved in. Dale's numbers said it plainly. He set a folder on the hood of his pickup and opened it so Virgil could see the projections. Virgil looked at the folder for a moment. Then he looked back at his oxen. "They fill 3 barns," he said. Dale Presser noted that this was precisely the kind of sentimental claim that was difficult to quantify, folded his papers, and drove back to town. That conversation took place 21 years before a check arrived in the spring of 2024 from a regional grain co-op that had never in its 60-year history paid a premium of that size to a farm of that size for grain of any kind. The check was for $847,000. It covered one season's harvest from the same 200 acres, the same 3 barns, and the descendants of the same 25 oxen that had stood in the mud the day Dale Presser came to explain the math of failure. This is the story of the years between those two moments and of what Virgil Haas understood about grain and soil and working animals that his county's most credentialed advisor could not yet see. If you have ever watched someone with deep knowledge of one particular thing be told by an expert that the thing they know is worthless, stay with this. There is arithmetic coming that will make the whole picture clear. Let me tell you what Virgil Haas was actually doing on that farm, because the word oxen tells you almost nothing useful unless you understand the mechanism underneath it. Standard model of grain farming in Cass County in 2003 ran on a straightforward logic. You planted corn or soybeans into chemically managed ground, applied anhydrous ammonia and pre-emergence herbicide in the spring, harvested with a combine that could cover 30 to 40 acres a day, and sold into the commodity market at whatever price the board posted that morning. The economics depended entirely on volume and efficiency. A small operator farming 200 acres with that model was competing against neighbors farming 2,000 acres with the same inputs and far better per unit costs. The larger the operation, the lower the cost per bushel, and the lower the cost per bushel, the more margin you had when the commodity price fell, which it did, regularly and without warning. A 200-acre operator running full chemical inputs with a combined payment attached to the operation had almost no cushion. The math was exactly what Dale Presser said it was, and on the commodity model he was looking at, he was not wrong about any of it. Virgil was not farming that model. He had not been farming that model since 1987, when his father, August Haas, handed him a leather journal with 60 years of field observations in it and told him to pay attention to what happened to the ground when the oxen worked it. August did not frame it as a philosophy. He framed it as a result. He had been running a working ox team since the early 1950 seconds, not out of nostalgia for some older time, not because he lacked the capital for a tractor, but because he had watched, in the fields immediately around him, what tracked steel and rubber tires did to soil structure over the course of years. He had watched the compaction layer form. He had dug test pits with a spade in his own fields and in his neighbors' fields, and he had seen with his own hands the way tractor worked soil, turned year after year with a moldboard plow at the same depth, developed a hard pan at plow depth, a dense, moisture-resistant layer, 8 to 10 inches down, a zone so tight that a taproot reaching it would deflect laterally instead of driving deeper, a zone that stopped infiltration during a heavy rain and sent water sheeting across the field's surface. He had written about it in the journal with diagrams of the test pits he had dug in 1953, and again in 1961, and again in 1969, showing the pan getting thicker and harder in the tractor fields across the road while his own ground stayed open. He had also noticed and written carefully what the fields his ox team worked looked like by comparison. The animal's cloven hooves, split and flexible, opened the soil surface with each step in a way that a rubber tire does not. They applied roughly 900 pounds of moving weight per hour, at walking speed, which is enough to work the soil without exceeding the load-bearing threshold below which compaction begins. Where a tractor tire applies 6,000 to 8,000 pounds per square inch at the contact patch and travels at a speed that prevents the soil from recovering between passes. An ox walking at 2 miles an hour on a cloven hoof applies its weight across a large, flexible contact surface and moves on before the soil structure below can fail. After the team, the soil surface showed the marks of individual hoofs, each one a small opened pocket in the crust. Within a day of rain, those pockets were entry points for water. Within a week, the soil below them was measurably more open than the same field's edge, where no animal had walked. August had written the water infiltration observations down in columns year by year. He had also noted, without fully understanding the microbiology at the time, that the fields his team worked did not seem to need as much fertilizer to reach the same yield as his neighbor's chemically managed ground. He had an instinct about the dung, but not yet the science to explain it. The science, which Virgil read in agricultural journals through the 1990 seconds, and which confirmed what August had seen by observation, runs as follows. An ox team working 200 acres continuously deposits roughly 40 tons of manure annually in the fields they travel. This manure is not processed through a lagoon or spread by a machine. It is placed directly in the crop zone in small continuous deposits while the animals work. Each deposit contains an active microbial community drawn from the animal's gut flora, a community that is extraordinarily diverse compared to the soil microbiology of chemically managed ground. Chemical nitrogen applied as anhydrous ammonia is highly effective at feeding crops in the short term and highly destructive of soil microbial diversity in the medium term. The ammonia molecule is biocidal at the concentrations used in application. It kills the bacteria and fungi it contacts. Over years of repeated application, the soil microbial community in a chemically managed field contracts toward the species tolerant of ammonia exposure and away from the diverse community that drives nutrient cycling, disease suppression, and aggregate structure. The soil becomes dependent on chemical input to function, the way a person taking antibiotics repeatedly may eventually find that their gut can no longer do without them. Virgil's fields, inoculated continuously with a diverse animal gut microbial community and never exposed to biocidal chemical applications, had built a soil biology that cycled nutrients, suppressed soil-borne disease. Tilth is an old word that the technical literature had largely abandoned by the 1970 seconds in favor of more precise terms. But it described something real. Tilth was the quality of soil that crumbles in the hand, that holds air and water in the right proportion, that allows a root tip to move freely in all directions, that warms quickly in spring and stays moist deep into a dry summer. Tilth is not a single measurement. It is the result of 50 years of a system working on soil without breaking it. Virgil had added to his father's original team over the decades, selecting breeding stock for temperament and working conformation, animals that stayed calm in harness and covered ground without fighting the implement. He had reached 25 head by the late 1990 seconds, maintaining the team in pairs, each pair trained to work together over 18 months of daily handling before they were put to field work. The training was the slow part. It was also, Virgil would say if you asked him, the part August had been most specific about in the journal. A green pair rushed into field work before they were settled was a danger to the equipment, to the crop, and to the operator, and the 18 months was not a guideline, but a floor. He had trained 12 pairs in his career and had never put one to work before the full period was complete. He planted a mix of heritage wheat and open-pollinated corn varieties in a 5-year rotation that August had developed through trial and documented in the journal. The sequence ran wheat, then wheat again, then a legume cover mix, then corn, then a fallow year with concentrated grazing. The legume year fixed nitrogen. The fallow year allowed the team to graze and dung the field in concentrated form before the wheat cycle resumed. The rotation was not efficient by any measure Dale Presser would have recognized. It meant only 2 grain crops in 5 years on any given field. It also meant the fields were never planted to the same thing twice in a row, which is the foundation of pest and disease suppression in the absence of chemical inputs. He did not own a combine. He harvested with a ground-driven grain binder that the oxen pulled, cutting and bundling the grain into sheaves that he then stacked for curing in the field before threshing. The binder had been his grandfather's, originally a 1941 machine that Virgil had rebuilt 3 times in 30 years, replacing worn parts with machined equivalents he had made himself or sourced from a small implement dealer in Louisville, Nebraska, who still kept a supply of antique binder parts for the handful of operators in the region who used them. Then he threshed with a stationary machine a 1939 unit he had found rusting in a grove on a neighboring farm whose owner had died without heirs in 1991 and had spent 8 months rebuilding with new cylinder bars, new concave liners, and a reconditioned separator shoe. The threshing method was the piece that nobody outside the specialty grain world understood yet. A combine's cylinder spins at 600 to 800 revolutions per minute and drives the grain through a concave at high velocity, relying on impact to separate the kernel from the head. In wheat, this works, but it introduces a stress to the kernel that the laboratory could measure. Microfractures form in the pericarp, the thin seed coat surrounding the endosperm, when the kernel absorbs impact energy during threshing at high speed. These fractures are invisible to the eye and do not affect the grade at the elevator. But they accelerate oxidation of the flour after milling and reduce the grain's enzymatic activity, which is the biological property that drives fermentation in bread dough and flavor development in long-fermented products. A combined threshed kernel that goes to a commodity elevator and is milled within 90 days of harvest is not noticeably affected. A kernel that is stored for 6 months, or that goes to a baker working with slow-fermented dough, shows the degradation clearly in the final product. Virgil's stationary thresher ran at 280 revolutions per minute in newt. The cylinder bar spacing was set wide enough to strip the kernel from the head by friction rather than impact. The kernels came off whole with intact pericarp and were augured to wooden bins where they cured for 3 weeks before being moved to the grain barns. The straw that came off the thresher was intact, not chopped, and went directly to bedding for the working team, then to a composting arrangement alongside the manure piles, and then back to the fields in the fallow year. Nothing left the farm that could stay. The 3 barns on Virgil's farm were full because the grain was clean, dry, intact, and produced on ground that had been deepening in fertility for 50 years. To the elevator in Weeping Water, none of this was visible. They would have graded it at the same number 2 hard red winter wheat as any other load that pulled onto the scale. Dale Presser's projections modeled inputs and outputs on a commodity market, where all grain of a given grade is interchangeable. There was no line on his form for soil organic matter trend, no column for kernel integrity, no way to account for the compounding value of a farm that was getting better every year instead of holding even or declining. There was a farmer 3 miles south named Roy Tenner who had bought Dale Presser's argument completely and built his operation around it. Roy was not a bad man or a careless one. He was 44 years old in 2003 and sharp enough, and he had spent the decade before that steadily expanding, financing a new 8-row planter in 1998 for $68,000, a self-propelled combine in 2001 for $212,000, and a set of anhydrous applicator tanks the following spring for another $31,000. His ground was in corn and soybeans in a 2-year rotation, chemically managed, GPS guided. He farmed 1,100 acres across 3 separate parcels, and his yields were exactly at county average, which meant they were good enough to service his debt load in a decent year and tight in a poor one. He sold into the elevator in Weeping Water at commodity prices and covered his notes in years when corn cleared $6 a bushel and sat down with his loan officer when it didn't. The combine was the piece Roy was proud of. It could cover 40 acres a day in good conditions, which meant his entire corn ground was harvested in under a month, which meant he could hit the fall market window that commodity advisors told him was the optimal pricing period. The machine sat in a dedicated equipment shed Roy had built in 2002 with a concrete floor and a roll-up door wide enough to drive the header through without folding it. Dale Presser had photographed it for a County Extension newsletter that year as an example of a well-managed operation planning for the future. Roy kept the maintenance log carefully and serviced it every season before harvest without exception. Roy's operation looked like success and was not wrong about most of what it was doing. But it was running, every year, at about $47 per acre in fertilizer and chemical inputs alone, plus $18 per acre in fuel and equipment maintenance, plus the debt service on the combine and planter that amounted to $22 per acre spread across the 100-acre base. His total cost of production in a normal year was about $4.1 per bushel on corn, which left him a workable margin at $5.8 corn, but almost nothing at $5.2. He had refinanced the combine once, in 2005, to get the payment schedule to a level that worked alongside a grain price dip that year. The soil in his oldest fields had been showing declining organic matter readings since the mid-90s. A soil test Roy ran in the fall of 2004 showed the south parcel at 1.9% organic matter. The state agronomist's office considered anything below 2% a depletion warning. Roy filed the report and kept planting because the yield numbers were still there, and the input program his dealer recommended was the same one his neighbors were running with the same results, and there was no practical alternative he could see that didn't require completely rebuilding an operation he had spent 15 years putting together. Virgil's fields, tested the same fall, came in at 5.7% organic matter. He showed the test results to his granddaughter Willa the weekend she came home from the University of Nebraska, where she was finishing a degree in agricultural economics. She looked at the numbers and then looked at Virgil, with the particular expression of a 22-year-old who has absorbed a great deal of current research and is genuinely uncertain what to do with a grandfather who seems to have arrived at the same conclusions by a different route. "You can't compete on volume," she said. "Dale Presser isn't wrong about that." "I'm not competing on volume," Virgil said. Willa went back to Lincoln unconvinced. She had a spreadsheet model she'd built for a class that showed plainly how commodity grain margins for sub-1,000-acre operators had been shrinking for 15 years. Virgil's farm showed up in her model as an anomaly, a term she used in her notebook, with no intended irony, not yet knowing it was the exact word Dale Presser had used 2 years earlier to dismiss it. What she didn't know, and what Virgil had not yet tried to explain, because explaining was not something he did naturally, was that he had been having a different conversation with a different kind of buyer for 4 years. Since 1999, a regional heritage grain broker named Carl Swick had been stopping by the farm twice a year. Carl worked out of a small office in Omaha and sold specialty grain to artisan mills, craft bread companies, and a handful of institutional bakeries that had started asking for non-commodity flour with documented provenance. He was not a large operation, but he paid for what he could verify. Carl Swick had first come to the farm because a soil scientist he trusted had told him that the Hass ground was producing heritage wheat with a protein content and kernel density that standard combine-harvested wheat did not reliably achieve. The threshing method, it turned out, mattered. A combine cylinder rotating at high speed creates significant friction and impact stress on the grain as it separates it from the head. In wheat with a thin pericarp, the seed coat that protects the endosperm, this friction introduces microfractures that accelerate staling in the milled flour and reduce the grain's enzymatic activity. Virgil's stationary thresher, running at low speed, separated the grain without that impact. The kernels Carl Swick sent to a lab in Kansas City in 2000 came back with intact pericarp, high enzymatic activity, and a protein reading of 14.8%, which was 3 full points above the commodity average for the region that year. Carl had been buying 60% of Virgil's wheat harvest at twice the commodity price since 2001. He had not told anyone else about the farm because he was a careful man who understood the value of a quiet, reliable supply. By 2005, the grain world was beginning to change in ways that would make Virgil's operation look less like an anomaly and more like the kind of asset that serious buyers protect. Artisan baking was growing as a market, and the bakeries that had been paying for flavor and protein were now also paying for the story of how grain was grown, and increasingly for documentation of specific soil health metrics. Carl was getting inquiries from buyers in Chicago and Kansas City who wanted provenance paperwork, soil test results, and photographs of the production method. Virgil's farm, with its 50-year organic matter record and its documented ox-worked ground, had more paperwork than some small wineries. The journal alone was 3 volumes by then, with Virgil's additions running alongside August's original observations in different ink. It was in the summer of 2006 that Willa Haas came back to the farm for a week and opened the journal for the first time. She had been working for 18 months as an analyst for a grain merchandising company in Omaha, and she had started to see, from inside the commodity system, exactly where its margins were thinning and where the premium markets were thickening. She read straight through the second volume of the journal, sitting at the kitchen table under the lamp that had hung there since August Haas built the house addition in 1958, and when she finished, she sat quietly for several minutes before she said anything. "Why didn't you tell Dale Presser about the protein numbers?" she asked. "He didn't ask about protein numbers," Virgil said. "He asked about yield per acre. That's a different question." Willa understood then that she had been asking the wrong question, too. Her spreadsheet model assumed a commodity price. Virgil wasn't selling at commodity price. He had been building, quietly and without announcement, a supply chain connection to a premium market that her training had not yet taught her to look for, because the commodities analysts she worked with did not model it. It was too small, too heterogeneous, too dependent on personal relationships and soil test results to appear in the regional market data. She went back to Omaha with a different set of questions. She began pulling research on heritage grain markets and on the emerging interest in what food scientists were calling grain provenance, the verifiable record of where and how a grain was grown, tested, and handled from field to mill. And she started spending more weekends at the farm, asking Virgil to teach her to read the journal. The summer of 2007 was dry across eastern Nebraska, not the kind of drought that makes the news, just the kind that takes 6 inches out of the topsoil moisture reserve through July and leaves corn farmers watching their ear fill come up short. County corn yields at August averaged 142 bushels per acre. Roy Tenner's South Parcel, with its 1.9% organic matter and its compacted subsoil, came in at 118 bushels per acre on a crop he had put $52 per acre into. He covered his operating note, but not his equipment payments. He extended the combine loan and filed a weather-related loss report with his insurer. Virgil's wheat, on the same soil, type 3 miles north, came in at 62 bushels per acre, on ground that had held its moisture longer because the organic matter was still above 5%. At the commodity wheat price that fall, that would have been a thin return. But Carl Swick took 65% of it at $9.4 per bushel against a commodity price of $5.85. The math was not complicated. Willa ran it for herself when she visited in September. She spread the numbers across 3 pages of a yellow legal pad at the same kitchen table and looked at the lamp for a while before she spoke. "He was going to lose the farm," she said. "That's what Dale told him. But he wasn't farming the same farm Dale was looking at." Virgil poured coffee and did not comment. The journal was open on the table to August 1961 entry on soil water retention in August's careful handwriting with a footnote in Virgil's hand from 1994, confirming the observation with a moisture meter reading. The dry summer of 2007 was a rehearsal. The structural shock arrived in 2012 when a heat event and drought of a scale that eastern Nebraska had not recorded since the 1,952nd spread across the entire Corn Belt from June through August and punished the uniform debt-financed, chemically dependent model in ways that no efficiency ratio or GPS guidance system could absorb. The heat began in the second week of June and did not break until mid-September. The county recorded 47 consecutive days above 90 degrees between July and August. The soil moisture readings in the County Extension Report for the week of the 16th of July showed topsoil at 15% of field capacity across most of the county, which is the threshold below which corn pollination begins to fail. In a chemically managed field with compact subsoil, that heat event meant the crop was drawing on a topsoil moisture reserve that could not be replenished from below because the hard pan at 8 inches stopped capillary movement from the deeper soil layers. The corn went into stress during its most critical growth period. Ears formed small and light, with missing kernel rows where pollination had failed in the hottest 2-week window. The county average corn yield in Cass County that year was 79 bushels per acre. The county average cost of production, when you included fertilizer, seed, chemical fuel, and equipment debt service for a typical debt-financed acre operation, was $4.9 per bushel to break even. The commodity price in September was $7.8 per bushel for corn, which sounded like a margin until you did the arithmetic on 79 bushels per acre instead of the 165 bushels the budget had been built on. Roy Tenner's South Parcel, with its 1.9% organic matter and its compacted subsoil, came in at 94 bushels per acre, on ground that had needed $52 per acre in inputs that spring. His cost of production that year on the South Parcel worked out to $6.31 per bushel. He made his operating note when the grain check cleared. He did not make his combine payment, which had been refinanced in 2010 and was running $23,000 per year. He had also replaced the planter's row units that spring at a cost he had charged to a line of credit that was now due in the fall. He spent October and November of 2012 in weekly conversations with his loan officer at the Agricultural Bank in Plattsmouth, working through what a restructuring would look like and which assets could service which notes. In February of 2013, the lender called the note on the South Parcel 320 acres of ground Roy had purchased in 2006 at the peak of farmland values in the region at $4,200 per acre. He had put $1.3 million into that purchase, and now it went to settle a debt that the drought had made it impossible to service. He did not lose the home farm, which his wife's family had held free and clear for 3 generations. But he lost the South Parcel and the North lease he had carried for 10 years, because the landlord, watching the region's numbers, raised the cash rent to a level Roy's shrunk operation could no longer absorb. By the spring of 2013, he was farming 780 acres instead of 1,100, and the combine that had covered 40 acres a day stood in the equipment shed looking like an asset that had become a liability by the simple arithmetic of a dry year. Dale Presser, by 2012, had moved from the county office to a regional position with the State Extension Service, covering 12 counties. He had not driven back down Virgil's gravel road in 9 years. When the 2012 drought reports came in and he was compiling county-by-county yield data, a name came up in a footnote from a commodity specialist at the state lab. Cass County, heritage wheat, 58 bushels per acre at full 14.9% protein. Thresher harvested, sold forward to specialty market at $11.2 per bushel. No operating note outstanding. Dale Presser requested the soil test record. It took a week to get back to him because it was 3 volumes of a leather journal, photocopied and mailed by Willa Haas from Omaha, where she had by then left the grain merchandising company and was working as an independent grain broker, specializing in heritage. The cover letter she wrote was 4 sentences long. The last sentence read, "The oxen fill 3 barns. You are welcome to come and see." He came in October of 2012, driving the same model of white pickup he always drove, and he stood at the same gate and looked at the same pasture, now occupied by the second generation of Virgil's working team, 18 of the 25 animals retained for breeding, and 4 young pairs in training. Virgil was 69 years old by then, lean and a little slower moving, with a brindle-coated ox named Chalk standing at his shoulder in the way that working animals lean into their handlers. Chalk had been born on the farm in 2007 and had been Virgil's lead animal for 3 years. Willa had driven up from Omaha the night before and was standing just inside the barn door with a copy of the soil test results and a folder of market contracts. Dale Presser looked at the pasture for a long time. Then he said, "I looked at the wrong numbers. It was not an admission that came easily, but it came plainly." He said it without qualification, which is harder than it sounds from a man who has spent 30 years being right about most things. He asked if he could look at the journal. Willa brought it out, all 3 volumes, and set them on the hood of Dale's pickup. He stood there for 2 hours reading August's observations and Virgil's annotations, moving from volume to volume, asking questions in a quiet voice. He asked about the threshing method, and Virgil walked him through it. He asked about the breeding selection criteria, and Virgil showed him the records. Quote, he asked about the protein test protocols, and Willa explained what Carl Swick's lab in Kansas City had been running since 2002. At the end of it, Dale Presser said that he would like to bring a soil scientist out to walk the fields if Virgil was willing. Virgil said yes. The scientist, a woman named Dr. Elaine Kruger from the University of Nebraska's Soil Health Program, came out in November. She spent a full day taking cores and samples. Her report, published the following spring in a regional agronomy newsletter, described the Haas Farm soil structure as among the 10 healthiest she had measured in the eastern Nebraska study region, with an active microbial community profile consistent with continuous organic matter addition. The article did not go unnoticed. Willa had been building Carl Swick's buyer network for 2 years by then, and when the article appeared, she started fielding calls from buyers she hadn't contacted. A heritage grain purchasing manager for a regional co-op named Platte River Grain came out to the farm in June of 2013 with 2 colleagues and spent an afternoon looking at the thresher and walking the fields. He offered a forward contract for 2014 and 2015 harvest at a price that made Willa write a number on a piece of paper and slide it across the table to Virgil without saying anything. Virgil looked at it. He nodded once. What the neighbors said when word got around was that Virgil Haas had gotten lucky, that the heritage grain market had moved in his direction through no plan of his own, that the timing was fortunate. 3 families who had been farming within 2 miles of the Haas's place their whole lives came by in the fall of 2013, asking if Virgil would sell seed from his heritage wheat stocks. He sold seed to 4 neighbors that winter at cost, meaning he charged what it cost him to clean and bag it, not a premium. He told them the threshing method was the piece that mattered most and spent 2 full Saturdays in the winter of 2014 showing 2 of the neighbors how to operate a stationary thresher using the 1939 machine as a demonstration unit. By 2014, Roy Tenner had stabilized his remaining operation on the home farm and was farming 780 acres with the combine and the planter. He stopped by the Haas place in the spring to look at the thresher. He stood there for a while watching it run on a test pass, and then asked Virgil what it cost to operate per bushel. Virgil told him. Roy looked at the number and stood there doing arithmetic in his head. "I can't get my whole operation onto that system," Roy said. "Nobody's asking you to," Virgil said, "but you've got that back 40 on the north end that floods out every 3rd year. You could try 10 acres. Roy Tenner planted 10 acres of heritage wheat on the north, 40 in the spring of 2014, using seed from Virgil's stock. He borrowed a small stationary thresher from an implement dealer in Ashland, who had acquired one at an estate sale and didn't know what to do with it. The grain he harvested that fall tested at 13.1% protein. Willa Haas called Carl Swick, and Carl took it at a premium price. Roy netted $14.4 per bushel on 10 acres of ground that had been producing $6.8 in corn the previous cycle. He expanded to 40 acres in 2015. The spring of 2024 came early and warm to Cass County, and Willa Haas, who had been running the farm's market relationships for 11 years while Virgil stepped back from the heaviest field work, received the call from Platte River Grain's purchasing manager on a Tuesday morning in late April. He told her the settlement check was being processed. He told her the figure. He said that the soil health documentation and the threshing records they had been submitting for 6 years had allowed the co-op to position the Haas grain in a new institutional market category that carried a multiplier they had not previously had access to. The check arrived on May 9, 2024. It was for $847,000. Willa was sitting at the kitchen table when it came under the same lamp that had hung there since 1958, with a 3rd volume of the journal open in front of her. Because she had been entering the spring soil test results, a habit Virgil had taught her to keep without interruption. She had been writing the April organic matter reading from the lower field, 6.2%, which was 0.4 of a point higher than the same field's reading in 2020 and 0.9 higher than the reading August Haas had recorded in the same field's first entry in 1953. The numbers sat in the column, and the check sat on the table beside the journal, and for a moment neither of them seemed quite real. Chalk. The ox was in the lower pasture with the rest of the working team, visible through the kitchen window in the morning light. Virgil came in from the barn at noon and sat down across from Willa, and she set the check on the table between them without saying anything. $847,000. Virgil looked at it for a long time. "Your great-grandfather would say that's what the ground was worth," he said. He did not say anything else about it. He poured coffee and went back out to the barn because 2 of the younger pairs were due for their midday training session, and they did not respond well to being kept waiting. Willa deposited the check the next day, paid off the last $15,000 remaining on a piece of equipment debt she had taken on in 2019, and set the rest aside for operating capital and for the expansion of the seed cleaning operation she had been building to serve the 11 neighboring farms now buying Haas heritage wheat stock each winter. She had a meeting scheduled for June with Dale Presser, who had retired from the Extension Service in 2021 and was now consulting with a nonprofit working on soil health documentation standards, to talk about getting the journal formally archived and the threshing method documented for the Regional Agricultural Extension Library. Dale Presser had been back to the farm 4 times since 2012. On his last visit, in the fall of 2023, He walked the fields with Willa and a soil scientist from a conservation organization that was putting together a case study on working animal tillage systems. He did not mention the folder he had set on the pickup hood in 2003. He didn't need to. He was taking notes. The conventional world has a way of measuring farms that is precise about some things and blind to others. It can tell you yield per acre and cost per unit and debt service ratio. It can tell you what a farm earned last year against what a farm spent. What it cannot easily measure is the 40-year trend in soil organic matter on a piece of ground worked by animals instead of machines, or the kernel integrity of grain threshed slowly instead of fast, or the market that does not exist in the commodity price feed but opens when a buyer finds what they've been looking for and won't negotiate. There is one kind of knowing that runs wide and confident across every farm in a county, built on equipment costs and commodity contracts and extension bulletins, and it is right about most of what it measures. There is another kind that runs deep into one particular piece of ground, built on decades of observation and recorded in a leather journal passed from one generation to the next. And it is right about the things the first kind cannot see. The first kind said Virgil Haas was going to lose the farm. It had the numbers to prove it. The second kind filled 3 barns. What is rigid breaks under the weight of a dry year. What is rooted holds.